Okay, so we will switch gears into bipolar disorders. As with depression, we won't go over each of the different types. We'll focus on bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Really with bipolar 1, the person is specified based on their most recent episode and what they presented with. So that could be presenting with manic episode, depressed episode, or hypomanic, or unspecified, so it doesn't quite meet the criteria for these three, and we'll talk about each of these in detail. Bipolar 2 does not have a manic episode, it's more hypomanic, which we'll talk about as well. For people that have cyclothymia, this is people that have symptoms of depression and hypomania, but they don't quite meet the severity cutoff. So this is still a disabling condition, so I don't want you to think of, oh, well, it's just a lightweight bipolar disorder. It's still incredibly disabling, but it just doesn't quite meet the criteria for a manic episode or a depressed episode. So we'll be focusing on bipolar 1 and 2 today. So with bipolar 1 disorder, they have to have at least one manic episode. So once you get criteria met for a manic episode, which we'll go over, that bumps you into bipolar 1. So you can't have a bipolar 2 disorder diagnosis if you've had a manic episode. So that's one of those differentials. And then, as I said, within that, once you have at least one manic episode, when you're specifying the diagnosis, you say what the most recent episode was. And then with bipolar 2 disorder, there's also differences in terms of time frames as well, which we'll go over. But the difference is they have to have had one major depressive episode and at least one hypomanic episode. So that's what changes the diagnosis from depression, because if they've just had a major depressive episode, they've got major depressive disorder, but then as soon as you put in the mix a hypomanic episode, that's when you're getting into bipolar 2 disorder territory. Once you put in the mix a manic episode, that's when you're in bipolar 1 disorder territory. So that's your basic way to differentiate these disorders. And so with a manic episode, so this is sort of an elevated, expansive or irritable mood, big increase in goal-directed activity and energy, and this is a key here. It has to be at least 1 week. So you're picking up on the common theme here. So it's a combination of a number of symptoms, and you also look at severity and length of those symptoms. So for a manic episode, the person has to have these criteria met for at least 1 week. And so for a manic episode, they have to have 3 or more of the following symptoms, so a sense of inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. So grandiosity might be that they believe that they have special powers in some way. Also a massively decreased need for sleep, so they might only need 1 or 2 hours of sleep and they feel completely rested. So it's not like us if we pull an all-nighter or something with your friends and you get an hour's sleep and you feel a little groggy but you only had 1 hour's sleep. This is very different. They have that much sleep and they feel completely fine, energized, and they hit the ground running. So it's an actual decreased need for sleep. There's also an increased rate of speech or talkativeness or pressured speech. Pressured speech is like that person that you talk to and they're like, it's like, it's kind of like, whoa, like so it's like when your friend's very, very excited and they want to tell you everything all at once. That's a form of pressured speech in a way. The other piece is flight of ideas, racing thoughts. Again, it's quite hard to keep up with these people, where they're going when they're in a manic episode. Also distractibility, because they're kind of here, they're going there, they're excited, they've got so many things going on at once, that it's kind of like shiny objects, you know, and it's enough to catch their attention. So it's that distractibility component. Certainly an increase in goal-directed activities. People are super productive, so people who are working who have a manic episode, they might actually really like it because they're creative, they've got increased goal-directed activity. There might also be psychomotor agitation, and the other piece that goes along with this is excessive involvement in pleasurable activities that have high potential for painful consequences. So might be risky sexual behaviour or drugs, that type of thing at this point. And it causes marked impairment in functioning, might need hospitalisation for the psychotic features, and the rule out is that these symptoms have to be occurring in the absence of substances or a medical condition. So you might think that seems like something that, you know, you would seek. People who might take ecstasy or something might seek some of these symptoms, but it's exceptionally high risk area. And so one of the people that I worked with in the trauma hospital had a history of manic episodes. It hadn't been diagnosed because he had never presented, because people like these manic episodes, but he had been, he was homosexual, and he'd been engaging in a lot of risky sexual behaviour. He'd been taking a whole heap of drug cocktails. He didn't even know what he had taken. He'd taken so many things. He'd been engaging in a whole lot of risky behaviours with a whole lot of people that he didn't even know, people he just met in a bar. And anyway, he ended up at the hospital where I was, a rehabilitation unit, because somehow at the end of one of these nights, he wound up on a train track. And fortunately for him, he wasn't killed, but it actually took off both of his legs. And so I was actually working with him because he was a double amputee. And you can see, yeah, certainly ended in painful consequences in that context. And the trouble was, he couldn't remember. He'd taken that many drugs. He couldn't confirm if it was a suicide attempt, couldn't confirm if he had gotten himself off that train track, couldn't actually confirm if it was attempted murder, because he had this memory of people swinging him under the train, but it wasn't entirely clear if that was just due to substances. You know, and so it does end in painful consequences. Certainly that's an extreme example. But this chap, I mean, he was known all over the hospital. My therapy sessions, I couldn't get a room that could contain the volume of his voice. Like, it was just, you know, I had people coming up like, what is going on in your therapy room? You know, like, because it was just so loud, you know, and so we actually had to work with him on, you know, toning down the volumes, because I was leaving those sessions with a headache. It was so full on. And so it's definitely, this is not just an excited friend, like this is like draining. It's so intense and full on in terms of the level of talkativeness and pressure of speech. So I use that example because we can sometimes hear about people that enjoy a manic episode, but again, this is a disorder. This ends in painful consequences and has ramifications for that person's functioning and life. Yes? This one? So we can look at increased in goal-directed activities and how is that a problem in terms of marked functioning. So we think of goals as a good thing So that individual's goal that I just described, that client, his goal was to have sex and drugs. And he was very goal-directed. And it ended in marked impairment. So that's sort of, an example of where not all goals are actually good goals. Think of somebody that's addicted to a drug. They will go to any length to get access to that drug. That is very goal-directed behaviour, and it's not necessarily adaptive. And so does that kind of give you a bit of an example of where those two can go hand in hand? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
So their goal is actually like not doesn't impair them in any way, like it's actually productive. So does that mean that was wrong with it by all?
So the question was whether their goal-directed behaviour was actually adaptive. And so that's actually why a number of people don't present with a manic episode, because they are exceptionally productive. They'll nail their deadlines at work. They go above and beyond. They're like a stellar performer. And the problem with that also is that, remember, you don't just have one of these things. Remember, to meet criteria, you have to have 3 or more. And so somebody who's exceptionally goal-directed but distracted will go like, boom, I'm going for this goal. No, I'm going for that goal. No, I'm going over here. And so it's actually the combinations of symptoms that cluster together to then be an impairment in function. Or perhaps it's the crash after the manic episode as well. So it's a combination of things, but what you're highlighting here is that it's often difficult to make a diagnosis because people don't see these symptoms as problematic. They like the increase in goal directiveness. They like their creativity boost. They like having this inflated sense of self-esteem that they can take on 100 tasks and get them all done in 20 minutes. So it's those types of things where it's marked impairment in functioning, but it also can be functioning in relationships as well. So remember, it doesn't have to be just marked